I'm with Paul Goodliff. He's the ministries team leader for the Baptist Union of Great Britain. Paul, just a few questions about discipleship, if you would. Starting with a personal one, what works for you? What helps with your own personal discipleship?
Yeah. The thing that has currently is helping me most is being a member of the Order of Baptist Ministers. This is something that arose first of all out of a conversation with John Colwell, who was at the time tutor in Christian doctrine and ethics at Spurgeon's, and then we involved by support group people like Colin Norris and Jeff Colmer, and over the last 3 years we've developed this religious order, new monastic movement. It's not quite either of those things, but it is something like that. So I'm in a cell group. We meet monthly, early one morning, and in the cell group we don't talk about work. It's not about what's going on in the church, or for me what's going on in my role as ministers team leader, but it's about what's happening for us as disciples, as Christian believers. There are 4 of us in the group. We have a shared daily office, so we've written our own daily office. That's means we're reading scripture and praying the same as everybody else in the order every day, and we meet in convocation. We gather together once or twice a year. So that's the bare bones of it. So it's deliberately about wanting to root the discipleship in some of the great traditions of discipleship formation that are 1,500 years old. So that particularly is helpful for me at the moment.
That's great. Not only are you a disciple yourself, but you have an interest in forming disciples, seeing particularly leaders moving on in their following of Jesus. So when you're working with people to encourage their discipleship, what are the signs that you look for that you're getting somewhere?
I think where there is a hunger for scripture, a hunger for prayer, where there is a willingness to reflect and review what's going on in their daily life in the light of being a follower of Jesus, so that it's a person is being transformed from someone who goes to church, or even someone who leads a church, into someone for whom there is a vital, living, daily, ongoing following of Jesus. That's really important, because I'm working mainly with ministers. I mean, I'm not a pastor in a local church, so I don't have much engagement with disciples who are, bank officials or shop workers or whatever. And what I detect in what ministers say to me is that long before their ministry begins to crumble, or their morals begin to fragment, and they somehow persuade themselves it's a perfectly acceptable thing to go have sex with that woman or whatever, long before that happens, they know that their own personal engagement and relationship with God has withered to such a skeleton, such a thin, shadowy experience, that they know they've lost something vital ever before the fragmentation happens. So I'm really keen that ministers see their ministry as the heart and core of it is their continuing relationship as a disciple of Jesus Christ. The other thing I see so often is ministers who have invested their whole life in ministry and the church, and when they retire, it's like, how am I a disciple now? There's no sense of, well, it'll be like I was before, because everything has been geared around preparing for the next 2 sermons or the Bible study, and there's not really been much which has been simply for them as a disciple in their daily walk with Christ. It's always been a mediation of the ministry that they have. And So one of the things I'm keen to encourage young ministers in and ministerial students is to say you've got to develop these habits and these roots into prayer and scripture, not just for the work you do, indeed not really for the work you do at all, but for you as a disciple, because at some point that role will be taken away from you, and what's left needs to be rich. If it's not, it's not a happy place to be.
Continuing discipleship sounds great, but it doesn't always roll easily. What makes it so difficult?
I think I think we live in a culture which looks for instant gratification, and discipleship isn't like that. I mean, there are occasions, one quite recently, when I had to make a very key decision about the future direction of life and ministry, and I was going in a particular way. I sort of made my mind up, sat down one morning, read the scriptures from the lectionary in the office, and it was as if God slapped me around the face with a wet kipper and said, son, that's not what you're going to do. You're actually going to go my way. So there are those immediate moments when as if God is right up in front of your face, eyeballing you. But very often it's not like that. You know, this is about putting down layers and layers and layers of attending to the word without an immediate, obvious outcome. But we live in an instant society, instant gratification. You know, what's God said to you today? Well, God might not have said anything to me today, but what has been laid down is the resources that I will be able to respond when he does say something. I think the other thing is that we live in a consumer culture which says really what we want is to shop around, and shop around for what is most emotionally affective. What makes me feel good? What makes me feel godly or whatever, or feel God's presence is near? I'm struck by the writings of St. John of the Cross, where he speaks about the dark night of the soul, and the purpose of it, when God seems utterly absent, is to wean us off this addiction to a sense of God's presence, which can actually replace God's presence. We're meant to put our faith in God, not in a feeling about God. And I think a lot of disciples these days put their faith in feelings about God, which is why our worship is so engaged in what feels good, in what is emotionally responsive, a feeling of God's presence. And if someone leaves worship without feeling God has been present, they might come to the conclusion, well, maybe God wasn't there today. Of course, it's nonsense. God was there before we turned up, and he stayed long after we've gone, and he's gone with us wherever we've gone. But this addiction to an emotional gratification, and I think it's you can see it in the wider British society. We were famously a nation which never cried, stiff upper lip. Whether it was the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, I don't know, but that has changed. We've become much more emotionally responsive. Largely, I warmed to that. I think we were very dull. But it has got this twist to it, which means I think people are much more addicted to the feelings of emotionally warmth when it comes to their relationship with God. And discipleship is not whether I feel like being a disciple. Discipleship is about God's called me to follow Jesus, come what may.
Yeah.
And I think those two things particularly spring to mind. Allied, I think, to a culture which is increasingly antagonistic towards the Christian faith. So we've moved from Christendom to post-Christendom. So it is harder to be a disciple and to express that discipleship in the actualities of your professional life, whatever else we might be saying. So it's tough to stand for the values of the Christian faith in a world which says, well, maybe that's challenged by the law, or maybe that's challenged by the wider culture. So it's become tougher to be a disciple, but it has also been in this context of a greater emotional addiction to this sense of God being present.
In your role as ministries team leader, what do you find that you can do which is effective to form people for ongoing discipleship?
Well, in my role, let me talk about two things. Most of what I'm doing is not directly personally engaged with other people in an ongoing way. That's simply the nature of the role. It's part of the cost of being ministries team leader. There was much more of that when I was superintendent, and much more of that when I was a local pastor, but one is in a sense a bit removed. My role in that regard is to enable there to be processes and structures and ways of understanding ministry which encourage ministers to see themselves as ongoing disciples, and largely others then to implement that. So, for instance, we're rolling out a program, all sorts of ways that ministers should be finding personal support and ongoing support. Things like something you'll know a great deal about, lifelong mentoring, or coaching, or being supervised, or being in peer supervision, or having a spiritual director, or being part of the Order of Mission, or the Order of Baptist Ministers, or whatever. The way that as a union we can have some influence on the shaping of what happens when ministers are being formed at college. So that continual discussion between the Baptist Union through its ministries team and the colleges about what are the priorities of ministerial formation. And I have a particular concern and passion that in all of the formation that we do of ministers, there should be something about the spiritual development of a minister. So we're not just deepening their understanding of the faith, and not just giving them skills to exercise ministry. We are focusing upon their character, their spirituality, and I think the colleges are really engaged in that process. So this isn't an antagonistic conversation with the colleges. This is a very open and fruitful conversation where together we see that the most important thing is not what the minister knows or does, but who the minister is. And if you get that right, the other stuff will be easier. But I do mentor two people personally. I saw one of my mentees just this week. We've been meeting for about 4 years. He was my assistant when I was last in pastorate, and he's moved on and is now pastoring a church. And we meet about 6 times a year over at lunchtime. And my responsibility there is he's accountable to me for how his life is going, and we talk about what he does, his ministry and his family and his life, and so that keeps my hands into that kind of ongoing discipling of a person. And I'm also offering some professional support to another very senior Baptist working outside of pastoral ministry, and again it's a kind of professional support stroke a bit of mentoring, and so I do a little bit of that within the demands of what I'm doing, and I do those two things very specifically because I don't just want to be someone who is telling other people how to do it or telling other people they must be doing it without myself engaged in it, albeit in a limited way myself. So that's those are two ways that I'm engaged.
That's great. Paul, thanks for talking to us today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.